Hello and welcome to An Aside with Alan, Volume 4. Today we are going to look at the role of Cabinet in the current Covid-19 crisis. So this is to give you an extra case study alongside the ones in the other materials for the role of Cabinet and some of the arguments about Cabinet and how it goes on. So we're going to try and look at five different areas in this video. So first of all, we're going to look at, is the government following public opinion or is it leading? And one of the big issues on this has been to do with testing, which it seems to have suggested that the government is being pushed or is not able to keep up with public demand or the demands from the media. We're going to see what was happening in terms of policy leadership. So as part of the role of a cabinet minister, we would expect them to be initiating and selecting policy. So are we clearly seeing that from different members of the cabinet? We're also going to see a couple of examples of how they're doing in terms of departmental management. So that is managing the resources and the budget of their different departments and how they're utilising those. Again, so we can get some idea of how cabinet works and we can see some of those actions. And we're also going to look at this debate in terms of what style of government we currently have. So are we going to see kind of cabinet government where we see the cabinet acting collectively and that power is held kind of collectively by cabinet? Are we seeing prime ministerial government where the prime minister dominates and the power seems to be in their hands, in the current case in Johnson's hands, and that the other members of the cabinet are there in supporting roles or advising roles? Or are we starting to see presidentialisation where we go even further than prime ministerial government and the kind of the policies of the government, the direction of the government is overwhelmingly connected to the prime minister? We saw this a lot in the past with Thatcher's government and with Blair's government. And what they also had was a degree of kind of public outreach, a way that they spoke directly to the people that kind of distanced them, separated them from the rest of the government, and people kind of saw the policies belonging to that particular prime minister. Again, so seemingly more like an American style president. So we're going to see which or what's happening with that in terms of Johnson and his cabinet in the current crisis. And we're also going to have a quick look at the significance of the return of experts. So not all that long ago, there was a suggestion from members of the government, in particular Michael Gove, that the British public had heard enough from experts. But interestingly now we see Prime Minister and cabinet members flanked by leading experts whenever they give press conferences. So again, an interesting change. So first up then, so is the public being led by the government or is the public leading the government? So we've got some interesting ones on this. We've had these press conferences led over recent weeks by Johnson, by Hancock, has been present at a lot of them and spoken at a lot of them, and Gove, and then today we've seen Dominic Raab. So we've seen members of the cabinet stepping forward and being then asked questions by the press, and they really have been pushed on the amount of testing that has been done. And it did appear, for example, with degrees of lockdown, school closures, things like that, there seems to be a clamour from a lot of the population and from the media before these things happened. Now, it's not unusual in a time like a crisis time to see a government, a cabinet go into essentially crisis management, and therefore what we see in these kind of circumstances is a lot more reactionary policy than proactive. So as ordinarily we might see this as a strong kind of criticism of government. They're simply reacting. In the current circumstances, it's probably more understandable because these are unprecedented events, and therefore we would expect the government to largely be reacting. And also, whilst the press and the public might demand things like the number of tests be available immediately, it obviously isn't quite that straightforward. And the Hancock in particular, will be working with his department to try and get these things online. But it does seem to be a bit of a case where the government seems to be slightly behind what is being demanded, and that could call into question the ability or the effectiveness of some of the cabinet. So if we move on to our next one, now are we seeing leadership in terms of policy? Well, definitely we're seeing that with Hancock, we've already seen on the last slide in terms of the setting up of new hospitals and his response to what's going on in terms of the testing and different types of testing. We've seen a lot of kind of referral and questions that have come on to some of the experts, but we are seeing a degree of leadership, and I think those areas, the health policies, a lot of those will belong to Hancock, and he will be seen to be have been driving that. We're definitely seeing that with Rishi Sunak in terms of driving the economic policy. And with the paying of up to 80% of people's wages, support for small and larger businesses, and a whole range of material. Again, we've seen a bit from some of the stuff from the previous slide with a bit of a lag in terms of the public and the media saying, well, what about the self-employed? And again, and those things are then followed through. But the huge raft of economic measures very much were presented by Rishi Sunak. And again, so we seem to have a degree of ownership or initiation and selection by him on those. With Dominic Raab, we're definitely seeing him taking a lead in terms of the repatriation of UK nationals who are abroad, and also some of the interaction with other nations in terms of coordinating and international response. Though we have on occasion seen a lot of that seems to be done in between both Raab and Johnson. So maybe we've got a bit there with the Prime Minister stepping in a bit in terms of an area of responsibility of a minister. Raab's job obviously has also expanded over the last day or so with Johnson being in hospital, and so we're seeing Raab kind of taking over to a degree. But there's some interesting stuff about that which we'll talk about a little bit later. So there have been these different kind of policies brought in. So we've seen a lot of that leadership on it, that initiation, selection of it from the cabinet, and now we're seeing them kind of moving the resources, using the resources of their departments to try and tackle the crisis. So we've seen the setting up of the Nightingale Hospital in London by the health department, and again, so we can see that Hancock has looked at the resources he has available. I think he's been given a lot more resources than he ordinarily would have been able to have, and he's used those to put something kind of tangible, something solid that's going to have an impact on the ground. We've seen the Foreign Office acting in terms of UK nationals that are stranded abroad, and we've seen resources allocated towards that, and quite substantial spending in terms of bringing people home. And earlier in the crisis, we saw things like the use of facilities as people came back and keeping them in a degree of quarantine before going back into the rest of society. And particularly, we've seen a huge amount of resource used by the Exchequer in terms of spending, supporting business and employees of the different industries and very wide-ranging parts of the economy that have been really badly hit by the crisis. And things like that have included the suspending of business rates and the paying of up to 80% of wages. And there's a huge resource in that, not only the money, but the resources in terms of the hours behind that and the organisation and the number of people who will be involved in actually carrying out those policies. There's a lot of work going on at the moment in between the Exchequer and the banks. So here we are seeing departmental management. A lot of this will be led, as we saw, with the leadership role by the cabinet ministers. An awful lot of it will be being done by the civil servants who work with them. So again, some good ideas, some good kind of clear examples of departmental management in the current crisis. So what are we seeing in terms of the cabinet and the different types of arguments we can have on this? So we do see quite a collegiate approach. We can see different cabinet ministers coming up and talking about areas that they're in charge of and what they are doing. Hancock talking about health, Sunak talking about the economy, Raab talking about repatriation of people and things like that. And so that might suggest a degree of a kind of a shared cabinet response. We did early on get very much Johnson front and centre, kind of a more looked like a prime ministerial government, with particularly with his address to the nation over the kind of lockdown that we went into, when there was a kind of especially scheduled presentation on TV, slightly different to the news conferences where he wasn't being asked questions and didn't have anybody else to decide him, which is kind of very much like a presidential address. So we've seen that aspect of it. Now, obviously, one of the things that's then made this really quite an interesting case study on this, and quite worrying in terms of what's happened, is obviously we've now got the issues with Johnson's health. Now, one of the things that's come across kind of really strongly in the way that that's been presented is that Johnson is still in charge. Johnson is still working. He may be in hospital, but he is still in charge of government. So this would seem, whilst this would have been a real opportunity to kind of celebrate an idea of a cabinet government, and yes, Johnson is ill, but Johnson is an important part of the government. He is not the government. The government still functions, and there are other people who can step in and take the lead. There seems to have been a real kind of push in terms of the releases coming out of Number 10 and out of the government to kind of go, look, Johnson is still in charge. Johnson is still in control. Now, this really does portray an idea of a prime ministerial government, or a degree of presidentialisation again. Now, this might be in part just to try and reassure the public that the Prime Minister at this moment of crisis is fine and everything is okay and there is no need to panic. So this might simply be reassurance, which again would be a perfectly good and understandable direction for the government to take. However, there might be more of a significant thing for in terms of our study in terms of type of government and relationship between Prime Minister and Cabinet, because it appears that even in his absence, the noises that are coming out of government is very much, this is Johnson's government, this is Johnson's management of the crisis. And that would lean more towards the kind of prime ministerial or presidentialisation. Difficult to do presidentialisation in absence, but there seems to be some suggestion that is an element or a key part of what is going on. And definitely from the early stages of the premiership of Johnson, with the cabinet reshuffle and what happened with Sajid Javid, seems to suggest that Johnson really does very much want his own people and wants to be in control. Having said that, we've then seen the advent of this move with the ministers being pretty much front and centre alongside him when it comes to this crisis. So the jury on this idea might still be out. And again, as you'll see from the notes and the other work that we've looked at, that there is no definitive answer to which style of government Britain has on this. And it does tend to vary from Prime Minister to Prime Minister, from Cabinet to Cabinet. And it might also, as we've seen in this, vary from event to event. And we're on exceptional times, and therefore we might be seeing something that is the exception rather than the rule. Right, and now something else that I found really interesting is this return of the experts. So Gove famously said during the Brexit debate in a TV interview that the British people had had enough from experts and were fed up essentially of being told what to think and what to do by these kind of elite groups. Now, what we've seen in the crisis is very much either side flanking either Johnson or whoever else is leading the press conference that day. People like those on the screen at the moment. So people like Patrick Vallance or Chris Whitley, who has returned from suffering with the virus himself, or Dr. Jenny Harries. And they have often been deferred to in answering questions from the press and giving more detailed explanations. So this seems like quite a shift for the government. And on other issues, be it education in the past or Brexit or quite notably on the environment, then the experts have been very much kind of pushed to one side, and kind of ideology and policy have kind of come to the fore and driven it. But with this event, with the health crisis that's going on, very much those experts on this area have been brought to the fore. Now, this could just be good government. This could just be the government going, well, look, we are not experts on viruses and on public health and on science on how long this kind of stuff is going to last or the best way of dealing with it. These guys are. These are the guys that we are listening to. And so we're getting a real insight into the way that advisors can be really, really important in deciding government policy. There is a more cynical view that can be taken on this, is that the government is almost bound to come into some kind of criticism as things go on, and how the government's response will be judged. It's far too early to say. But they are going to quite conveniently have a group of people that they can point the finger at now and go, you can't blame us, we were just listening to these guys. So it wasn't our decision to do that, it was based on the advice of the following people. And so almost it can shield the current Prime Minister and Cabinet for any severe criticism that might fall their way either now during the crisis or afterwards, and they can say, well, it might not have worked, but we were acting on the best possible advice. And this might actually bring about an interesting change, and we might start to see this more in more ordinary circumstances, when a government brings in a policy and then maybe brings out the expert, the academic, or whoever else has been advising them, and go, and this is the science behind it, the economics behind it, the sociology behind it, whatever it might be. So it could be an interesting development. It might be a blanket, a protective blanket for the current cabinet and government. So an interesting shift. Now, as we go forward, there will be a judgment brought on the government about how they've handled the crisis, and how Johnson and his cabinet develop and how they work together. We will continue to see going through the crisis and then coming out the other end. And it's then up for you to make that decision. So are we seeing good leadership on policy area from different cabinet ministers? Are we seeing them effectively deploying the resources that they have available to them? What kind of government are we seeing? Are we seeing cabinet government, prime minister government? Are we seeing presidentialisation? And what is the significance of the emergence and reliance on these experts? Is this going to be something is just for this crisis? Is this going to see a change in direction under Johnson's government? Right, I hope you found that interesting. I shall speak to you all soon.